Okay, we are live. I am super excited about my guest this afternoon. Hello, welcome, Liel.
My pleasure. I have to say, your shelfie game is really strong. I thought mine was something, but you take the cake.
I've got a lot of other books on the other shelves and in my office. So if I really wanted to impress you, I would just bring all of my Sfarim, all my Jewish books, and just pile them up behind me. I need to have some credibility. So this is what I got. It's either that or my degrees. But anyway,
Well,
thank you
I
so much.
display liquor, so what do I know?
He tells us about something about each other, I guess. So Liel Leibovitz. Please tell me if I'm mispronouncing that.
Pronouncing it very well.
Okay, Liel Leibovitz is our guest on the Wildscast MGE's podcast. He is from Tel Aviv. He is born and bred in the Holy Land, and he's an Israeli American journalist, author, media critic, and yes, video game scholar. I don't know if you've ever heard about that, but you're going to be hearing about it. He's also the co host of the wildly popular podcast Unorthodox. As I mentioned, Liel was born and raised in Israel, became interested in America at the very young age of 9. And he was also a non commissioned officer in the spokesperson's unit of the IDF. He got his BA from Tel Aviv University, and then after coming to New York City, got his MS in journalism and a PhD in communications from Columbia University.
I hope my mother is listening because this sounds not at all like me and yet very impressive.
Yeah, well, listen, I need to establish your credibility, and then we can have a regular conversation. Lastly, Liel served as culture editor of the Jewish Week and has written for The Nation, The New Republic, and he is now the senior writer and executive producer of video and interactive media for American Jewish Tablet Museum magazine, excuse me, not museum. Hasn't been relegated to museum yet. It is a very active and wonderful publication. And he was a visiting professor at New York University and is currently a visiting professor. I know this personally at Yeshiva University because Liel, my son Yehuda, who is a senior in high school, is taking a early admissions college class with yours. Well, not yours truly, with you.
Look at that.
He was taking your Zionism course. You're co-teaching that with Meir Soloveitchik, who's a friend. And he unfortunately couldn't stay in it, didn't work with his schedule, but he got to sit in on a few classes. He's just a senior in high school, but he's got a real interest in you and in your writings, your teachings, and that's our connection anyway.
I'm very happy to hear this. You're also hearing another member of my family now in live broadcast. This is Lila, who's very excited to be here on this podcast as well.
Well, we may have a few questions for her as well. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for being such a wonderful teacher to my son and to so many other people. I'm going to get right into it. You've experienced in your adulthood some real changes. You've moved, it seems, a little from left of center to right of center when it comes, I'd say, in the political sphere, and you've also become more observant over the years. And this is interesting to me, Jewishly, religiously observant. It's interesting to me because, as you might know, I've devoted my life to Jewish outreach and education. MGs primarily for 20s and 30s who are not coming from the Orthodox community, from the religious world. They've got maybe a bar, bat mitzvah, Hebrew school background, high holidays, Passover, Seder kind of thing, and learning to learn more. And this crazy political climate in which people have sort of pigeonholed themselves pretty discreetly. It's just impressive to me when I meet someone that's changed one way or the other. So tell us a little about that.
Well, there are so many wonderfully glib and insincere answers I could summon that will sound really good. First and foremost, of course, is insisting, as every good convert is legally obliged to do, that I haven't moved an inch. It's the rest of the world that has, inconveniently shifted around me. But I think if I'm being fully honest, then the real answer that that resonates is that I simply don't know. These processes are very much aligned with the old Jewish spirit that we mentioned not long ago in the Parsha. of Naaseh v'nishma. We will do first, and only then hear. These processes were sparked in me by a whole host of observations that sprung from paying attention to the shifting socioeconomic and political landscapes around me. They were sparked by personal, life events, like becoming a father, and you
Mhm.
know, whether I liked it or not, maturing, or at least aging. But really, they were those
How old is your son or daughter?
a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old. So
Wow.
we're in the
Wow.
trenches right now. Um, and so I think really the most honest answer is that these are urges. You could call them, primordial. You could call them, if you're Freudian about it, the return of the repressed. You could say, if you're Rav Kukian about it, that it's some kind of Jewish spark that resides in all of us. But at some point, it calls out to you, and I think if you open up heart, mind, and soul, and you let it do its thing, it leads you to realms that you weren't expecting. It was very much like this when I decided, for example, to keep kosher, something that was personally, intellectually speaking, inconceivable to me, being many cheeseburgers removed from the faith of my fathers, as someone who used to enjoy bacon on a tri-daily basis. Yet, as soon as I sort of took this leap of faith to again conjure, you know, Exodus imagery, um, I found out that not only was it not difficult at all, in fact, it felt wonderful, and that was the strangest part of it for me. This realization that there is a higher moral order that precedes the intellectual order. That there are things that feel good and feel right, and just urge you to do them, even though if you were asked to explain them intellectually, you
Mhm.
simply couldn't.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. What can you tell us a little about your background, just growing up in Israel and coming to the States? Were you,
Sure.
yeah, just did you go to day schools, Jewish schools, not Jewish schools? I'm just curious.
So the mishpucha, the family, was one, as we say, with great yichus, with great rabbinic kind of respect. My great grandfather was a man by the name of Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld.
Oh,
Was the right? If you know the name, is the answer
whoa.
that I usually get, is a famous rabbi who is the fiercely anti-Zionist, fiercely Haredi leader of the stringently Orthodox community in pre-state Israel. And most of my family is still Haredi. We were the kind of odd clan out, the ones who moved to Tel Aviv and were a little bit further removed from observance. However, I grew up at least firmly traditional, if not always very observant. And yet, as I grew older, I sort of drifted a little bit, not in my faith in God, which has always been and remained very strong and unwavering, not in my Jewish pride, which was equally as strong, but in this idea that there was any real correlation between keeping mitzvot, between any form of Jewish observance, and the higher order, as I saw it then, of some kind of spiritual connection that
Mhm,
one
mhm,
could feel just by dint of being Judaism. I thought, naively, as I understand now, that I could still be very much in the thick of things. That the rules, such as they were, didn't apply to me. That I could giddily embody the best of all worlds by being a PhD in a as we said, video games, as I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about later, by teaching in a big secular university, by feeling completely enmeshed in the sort of secular progressive world, and at the same time having nothing but my declaration of faith to certify my membership in the club. And the older I got, the older I realized that it simply didn't work that way.
mhm,
In part because I felt that I felt very strongly the vicissitudes of the collapse of the secular world order, the let's say vision of the Enlightenment, that we're all experiencing these days.
Mhm.
The falling apart of political systems, the disintegration of formerly great cultural institutions into a shadow of their former selves, the kind of disappearance of kind of essential corners of culture that I thought would be here forever. And at the same time, I also realized, which I guess only comes at least to those of us who, like myself, are more dense than others, when you grow a bit older, the true beauty and wisdom of practice, the way that it does things to you, the way that it connects you to community, the way that it forces you to take these ideas from the mere realm of, abstractions,
Mhm.
and sort of like, general perceptions into the realm of lived reality, of lived experience, which is so much deeper and so much more evocative and so much more moving. And the investment is far greater, but man, is the payoff ever so richer.
Wow. Thank you. Wow, that's I appreciate that the sentiment of the focus on the practice. We could sit here till we're blue in the face and philosophizing, but I've always been trying to teach this. Though, as you can see, I'm not a Lubavitcher, but the Lubavitch, who believes so much in just put those tefillin on, put it on, do it, practice, and see what happens afterwards. That kind of approach. I don't know if that's exactly what you were trying to articulate, but I come from a little more of a rational, cerebral kind of background where everything needs to make 100% perfect rational sense before you go. And as you said before, the nasa v'nishma, just sort of accepting and doing and seeing how that plays out is something that I also personally have been getting into the last couple of years. I wasn't going to ask you this till later, but since we're still on your personal life, if you don't mind, your personal spiritual outlook. Your father, actually, my son came home and was like, Dad, did you hear about this guy's father? So your father, Ronnie Leibovitz, you should live and be well, was Israel's most famous bank robber. There's a stamp, I'm told, with your father's face on it. He's a legend in Israel. So I'm just wondering, what was it like, first of all, being the son of a famous bank robber? Excuse me, I've never been able to ask anyone on this podcast that question. And how did that play into what we were just talking about now in terms of your own spiritual development?
What was it like is a question that is very hard for me to answer, because it would necessitate me knowing any other experience and any
Mhm.
other reality, which is simply not the case. I'm also speaking with my children within earshot, so I'm going to be selecting my words more carefully than I usually would. But I will answer the question by saying that there is definitely something very sobering about it. I think that the only great enemy we have, or one of very few great enemies that we have, is this notion of comfort, of convenience, of sinking into a life routine that is unexamined simply because there's no reason to examine it. And that was very much my reality until my father was arrested. We were an affluent, upper middle class family. We grew up in this what I understand now to be a deeply privileged existence, and all of a sudden to be thrust into a routine of having to visit prison weekly, of having to interact with a whole host of humans who were nothing like the ones that I had known. Of having to consider, really, in the grandest, most Dostoevskian sense of the world, of the word, fate, right? What happens when sort of unthinkable, unspeakable happens, and how the world so often works entirely independently of your own plans, hopes, wishes, and assertions. Made me a very different person, and frankly, I don't know that I would have very much liked the kind of person I would have been had that not been the case.
Wow. Well, I appreciate that, and I hope you don't mind putting you on the spot.
Not
And
at all.
and I think that was not only acceptable for your kids, but your dog as well. I think everybody was probably happy with that
Everyone
answer.
is quiet, in quiet awe,
Um, so,
contemplating destiny.
well, let me just, most people who have PhDs from Columbia don't write books about Spider-Man and Pac-Man. So tell us, you've written books about video games and comic books. What draws you to write about these areas that, you know, a lot of people would think are just for teenagers or geeks? Tell us a little what's your attraction and what's the lure?
I think that the truly sacred, and this is an observation I am precisely the eighth million person to have come to. There's a whole host of Hasidic masters and fellow smart Jews who've gone there way before me. I think that the truly sacred so often resides not in these hallowed halls of well analyzed, well examined intellectual traditions, but precisely down in the street, where people are doing things, where people are having pursuits that open up hearts that excite people for real reasons. And I don't believe for one second that we do these things, that we read comic books, that we play video games simply as distraction. I think that is a very grim view of humankind. I think there is something about these media that encompass very, very, very ancient traditions. It's spiritual energy, like every other form of energy, never wastes away. It simply gets recycled. And so when I started thinking about video games, which I did from a very early age, but when I started thinking about it as an adult, I realized how much about video games not only replicated but really sort of embodied the same kind of emotional, psychological, and even spiritual procedures that you would see in, say, religious practices. I did a host of actual experiments with gamers, and found out that being in a trance-like state, that being actually induced into a kind of head nodding, not anti-intellectual, but unintellectual, non-thinking, just totally swept away type of condition is actually completely crucial to game playing, and also very central to why so many people play games. We don't play games to quote unquote while away the time. We play games because, whereas in every other corner of our existence we are required to be these present, atomized human subject that thinks and gives like very concrete responses that are tethered to logic and reason, there has to be some realm of our life in which we are free to simply connect, in which we're free to simply engage, in which we're free to simply kind of, to use a word or a term popularized by a great rabbi, the late Ram Dass, to simply just be here now. And games really let you do it. They shut off reason in the best way. They plug you into deeper reservoirs that religion formerly used to be the main conduit to. And to me, to look at these connections and to understand what happens to you when you plug back into them is so incredibly fascinating. Because if something is that meaningful to that many people, it's not just narcotics. It's much more than that.
So you're saying that because it's not cerebral, I mean, there is some part of the brain that is operational when you're playing video games, but you're saying because it doesn't require you to think in the normative ways we're used to, and you can get so into it, you're saying that in that practice of being present in something is a very important exercise? Or is there something about the games, the competitive aspect, or is the video? I want to drill down a little. I want to try to understand.
So I'll answer like this. We had an experiment designed in which we asked players to play video games for long periods of time, and we would interrupt them in different points throughout the game. And we would then ask them to answer a series of simple math questions that were designed to basically make sure that their cognitive capabilities were all kind of tethered elsewhere. And then we had them return to the game and sort of gauged using a whole host of metrics how easy or difficult it was for them to sink right back into the game. And we did this at two varying points. We repeated this experiment and did it in varying points in the game, some of which were highly sort of critical to the plot, big reveals, big fight scenes, big things that you really would be completely immersed in the game, and some completely random, just meandering about in the world game, looking for an entrance or doing something in which the actual involvement with the game would have been very, very low. And time and again, we found the exact same thing. We found that where you were in the game completely didn't matter. You could be in a highly uh, exciting, thrilling point, or you could be in a totally meaningless point. The only thing that had any implication, any correlation on how difficult it was for you to re-immerse yourself in the game was how long you've been playing the game for. If you've been playing for 20 minutes, you were right back in the thick of things before you were interrupted. If you were playing for 4 hours before you were interrupted, it was virtually impossible for you to get back in the game because we realized you had just been pulled out of something that could only be described as a trance-like state, which every self-respecting religion, our own tradition very much included, goes through great lengths to give you this opportunity to be in that mindset. For example, to me, the reason that you start each day with I don't know how long it takes you. It takes me about 45 minutes to pray Shacharis properly.
Mhm.
It's because you get sucked out of the rhythm of the everyday world and into a rhythm that is different. Shabbat sucks you into a rhythm of life that is different. And I think one of the perils of life in an overly rationalized, overly subjectified world is that you lose your ability to do that. Everything
You
is
lose your ability to get back into those.
you lose your ability to get out of time. You lose your ability to
Mhm,
step out of reason. You lose your
mhm.
ability to stop being a concrete atomized individual who
Yeah.
assesses everything as a calculating machine that always has to weigh one set of considerations against another. You just want to get lost in the flow of creation. And I know it sounds very
No, 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 no. This
out
is
there,
incredible.
but I think that's what games do. I mean, they take you out of yourself, out of your own skin, out of your head. This is something that so many, I think, good shrinks used to tell their therapists: get out of your own mind, get out of your own head.
Right.
It's exactly what games do. They take you out and they plug you into this realm of creation. And if you want to get too metaphorical about it, the game is actually really interesting because there is a code. Video games are, they're software, but you're playing in a world created by a designer who you've never seen, who set out rules that you will never fully understand, that you can't actually ever really follow to their perfection, and yet you're so thrilled and so grateful to be in the thick of that creation because you get to experience something that allows you to, for one fleeting moment, plug into something that is larger than yourself.
Wow, wow. I mean, I'm thinking tefillah, I'm thinking prayer, not only because you brought it up as an example, but that's such a struggle. It's a struggle for me personally. I mentioned before I'm a little more cerebrally oriented, although I've gotten in the last couple of years, I study with my son the book of Tanya, and I'm actually teaching a class in it now because it forces me to have to know it well enough to explain it. And
You say you're not Chabad.
um, yeah, I know I'm a little of self-contradiction, but I just find this fascinating. In other words, you want to get people more lost in the flow, and that's so important to be Jewish, to be to actually get something out of these mitzvot as opposed to just sort of checking them off. That I performed mitzvah A, mitzvah B, but I actually became a part of it. I'm absorbed within it, whether it's a prayer experience, whether it's Shabbat. Um, I don't know if you can do that, let's say with kashrut, that I'm eating this, food. You mentioned a cheeseburger before. I'm eating a kosher meat as opposed to non-kosher meat. I don't know if how that would work, but that would be amazing. Have you had any success with actually using video games to help people, learn how to access that flow, whatever it is they're trying to get into? Let's say in our case, Judaism.
See, that's an amazing question. A while ago, our friends in the sadly dearly departed Bim Bam created a Leviticus video game, which I just thought was the absolute greatest thing ever because Leviticus has that logic, right? It's like, here's a book with a bunch of rules, and if you don't follow them, bad things happen.
Right.
But the connection here to me is not at all tenuous, and this is I will not be surprised, even though I have no real evidence or numbers to offer here, but I will not be surprised if the sort of return to tradition that we're seeing now, especially among so many young people, has to do with the popularity of video games as a medium, because it all goes back to this realization that I sort of stumbled on too, and that we discussed a while ago, the notion of what happens when you do instead of think, right? Because I understand Judaism's commands and precepts because I have read a book. And I'm a very smart person. I have a doctoral degree from an Ivy League university, and I'm perfectly capable of abstracting things. And by the way, it's kind of icky and gross to me that I have this religion that focuses on so many things that I have to do because doing is for suckers, right? We're more evolved being. We're enlightened. We're man who thinks, not man who does. And then you get into this point when you stop reading and you start playing video games. You get into the point when you stop thinking about Judaism and you start practicing Judaism, and you realize, oh my, OMG, as we say in both video games and Judaism, ironically, right? It's a totally different thing because once you embody it, it feels different, because then you have to ask yourself the question that you just asked, I think so brilliantly, like, what am I doing here?
Right.
Am I doing this right? Am I feeling the right things? Which again, prayer 3 times a day forces you to do always. And here's the thing. I don't know about you. Every morning, every afternoon, and every evening, I feel like I have failed at davening. I have failed at prayer. I fail 3 times a day at prayer. My only hope and my only source of consolation is that every day I fail a little bit better. Every day I understand a little bit more about what I got wrong the day before, and it opens up a little bit of another intersection. These are things that I will never be able to think my way into because you can't. This is why, not to be too crass about it, but this is why there are no good. There's no good literature that aptly describes sex. Because you can't think your way into that. You can't
Yeah.
think your way into some kinds of experiences, and there are not many of them in human tradition that simply transcend our ability to sort of turn things into abstractions. You had to be there. You have to be here now. Video games do that. They keep you here now.
Wow. I guess that's why our good friend Scott supplied me with this great quote from you. It was in an interview given to NYU student Steinhardt News. You said that every gamer, I believe, is secretly an aspiring theologian.
Mm-hmm.
And I would
What I
imagine
really meant, which I could say to you and not to them, is like every gamer is seriously an aspiring chassid.
well, that is really what the Hasidic world that I've taken as a couple of, dipped my toes into is much more about the experiential than it is the understanding, the cognitive, rational understanding. And that's hard because it's hard to break with that kind of motif, or that kind of way that we're used to operating. And it's like what you said before about getting ourselves out of our own heads, because it does keep, and this is very personal and autobiographical. I feel like it does keep me from feeling more connected to Hashem. It keeps me from getting my own students, who sometimes much younger than me, don't have the same learned background perhaps as I do, but they're a little more tapped in sometimes because they're not thinking as much. They're trying to be in the moment. They're trying to feel whatever it is that these words that we're saying in the tefillah are supposed to make us feel, or whatever we're supposed to experience on Shabbat. And you're right, there's no book. There's no book that can capture that. And it's so interesting that a video game, the only justification I could ever have as a kid, I remember I used to go to this Borscht Bed Hotel when I was a kid, Grossingers. I don't know if you ever heard of it, but it's unfortunately no longer. And wait, hold on a second. I just lost you there. I apologize. I remember Shabbat. So not everybody in the hotel was Sabbath observant, and um, and the video games were going all Shabbos. A big glass booth with like 20 video games, and I used to literally walk around on the floor looking for an extra quarter, because I ran out of all the change my parents and everyone else I schnored off of in the hotel. And then literally I'm waiting on Shabbos to like get back to my Miss Pac-Man, my I don't know, Space Invaders. I'm really dating myself now, but it was always kind of looked at as a like a vice, as something which was just I can justify because I need a break from my real things in life. And what you're suggesting is that kind of activity, anything else besides video games that might be helpful to our listeners, that they can use as practice. To me, I'm all ears. That we can use as practice to help get ourselves more in the flow of what we're doing, because I think that's so critical to being an observant Jew.
Well, there is so much to unpack. I love this image, by the way, of you sort of like, trolling around looking for quarters. Just, not to dwell too much on the sort of theology of video games, but even if you consider this, the notion of scarcity, right? The idea that there is something um that exists theoretically in abundance, that is limited for you, because video games don't have to end, especially now that we've moved from the arcade, in which putting in that other quarter is the business model, to the home console. You could play as long as you want. Why is the phrase "game over" so incredibly sort of kind of enmeshed and rooted in our culture? Well, I think, like every good theologian would understand right away, it is because the uh, illusion of the infinitude of time and space, for an average human being whose life is but a fleeting moment, is something that we need to sort of grapple with. And this notion of a game that suddenly ends, of being thrust out of the cycle and back into it, is actually a terrific, I think, reminder. Yes, what else does this? I mean, I think probably to anyone listening, I've probably crossed the line into the kooky a long time ago. But I would say that some years ago, I had the privilege of learning transcendental meditation, which is something that I still practice. I don't want to say religiously, because I
Mhm.
reserve that term now for other things, but practice daily with great results. And it was actually kind of amazing to me, having started doing it at more or less the same time when I started davening 3 times daily, realizing how transcendental meditation in particular, but really all forms of meditation, have in common with the notion of prayer, both being predicated on the cyclical emotions in which you're asked to focus on something that by definition is external. It's a mantra. It's some prayer written thousands of years ago by men who lived in very different realities than your own. And then a natural thing happens to you, which is your mind wanders. It wanders back to you. It wanders back to the things that bother you. It wanders back to your life or your kids or the job or anything that, God forbid, your health, anything that's literally on your mind. And then I apologize, my messages, I don't know how to stop,
I don't either. I got
and
the
it
same
goes
problem. Don't worry, you're good.
crazy, crazy,
You're good. You're
crazy,
good.
crazy. And then here's what happens to you. You find yourself in this cycle of trying to figure out how to get back to the things that you're supposed to be focusing on, the prayer, the meditation. But as you do, you also find yourself noticing what it was about your own thoughts that kept you preoccupied. And
Mhm.
it puts you
Mhm.
in this weird condition in which you both get to literally know yourself better, and also get to become more and more and more engaged in the thing that you are doing, because now your mind is free. You've acknowledged, you've checked off that little button that says, okay, I understand. I am very preoccupied about my boss being a jerk to me. Now, can we please get back to the mantra? Now, can we please get back to Modiani? Yes, we can. And it works wonderfully well.
That you should know the Balatanya actually talks about like inappropriate thoughts and he says it. He spends a lot of time saying. By the way, just anyone listening, the Balatanya was Rosh Ner Zalman Liadi, who was the first founding Chabad, brilliant thinker and halachicist as well. He said that, sometimes thoughts come into our minds, and we can't necessarily control that. What we can control is to whether or not we're going to dwell on the thought, or we're going to just swipe it, push it along, or if it's like a little bubble, think of it like a thought bubble, pop it. We may not be able to control it entering our minds, but we can we can decide whether we want to engage it. We want to whether let it sit there for a while or not. I think that's really amazing. Tell me a little about the you've written about Stan Lee, Marvel Comics, as uniquely Jewish. What is it about Lee's characters that are more Jewish than, let's say, DC's?
Oh,
Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman.
I could lie on the couch behind me and talk about this all day.
Well, I have another follow-up, and I don't want to take too much of your time. So yeah, but please.
So, we were sort of launched into this world of superheroes with these like two archetypal characters, Batman and Superman. Of course, both were created by Jewish artists, but Jewish artists operating and writing in a time in American culture in which Jewish culture and Jewish artists were still not as ascendant as they would be just a decade or two later. And these characters, I very much believe, are the literal embodiments of the two kind of poles of the Protestant drama in American life: the head and the heart. Right. On the one hand, you have a character like Superman, who some say Moses, but I argue very fiercely, ferociously in my book, that is a really kind of Christ reincarnate. He's the one who does not quite die for our sins, but takes a bullet for our sins every day. He's infallible and impervious to all sorts of human kind of interactions and attempts to unseat him. He is also the embodiment of the fundamentalist feeling that has fueled so many tent revivals. You could hear, the sort of notions of Superman there in words of theologians like Jonathan Edwards. This is the manifestation of the complete fiery person who comes and redeems in one fell swoop.
Yeah.
And then you have Bruce Wayne, who is a person with absolutely no superpowers except for a large brain and an infinite bank account, who, by virtue of using his God-given talent, creates, and using not his heart but his head, creates this mechanism called Batman, with which he could make the world better. And serious theologians like Gary Wills have written a lot about this kind of tension between the head and the heart that was at the core. I don't want to say at the heart of it, the core of the Protestant drama. This is in many ways what, say, for example, the Scopes Monkey trial was about, right? The clash between these two ways of understanding life: fundamentalism on the one hand and modernism on the other hand. Now,
you should just know that I should make the bracha Baruch Shekivanti. There's a blessing you make when you come up with something that you think a great scholar thought about. So I did an Eli talk, which is like a Jewish version of TED Talk, and I used the Batman Superman exactly. I just thought of this on the spot, which was that Superman, especially when he levitates a tiny bit off the ground, and there's some of the movies. I'm not even talking about the DC, the comics, but in the movies they sometimes have him with a glow, and he's levitating, and he's this picture perfect figure from some other planet that is sent to Earth to save and redeem mankind, which is incapable of redeeming itself. I mean, it's Christianity 101. Batman, who you just said, you articulated it so beautifully, no superpowers whatsoever. He's basically Bruce Wayne dressed up as Batman, whereas Superman is really Superman who dresses down as Clark Kent. But those, and I tried to. I'll send it to you if you want. Anybody can, that really, I think, helps distinguish between the Jewish concept of the Mashiach and the Christian concept of the Messiah. This picture perfect individual coming to save mankind, as opposed to the Jewish concept of the Mashiach, who's from King David. And King David, we know, as as a great poet and warrior and righteous, was also someone who was quite flawed. And not only from the David side, but the other side as well. Meir Soloveitchik, your colleague who you teach with, has a brilliant article about this, on how the Jewish Mashiach comes from purposely a very flawed kind of family. So, because the goal of the Jewish Mashiach is not to save us, but inspire us to save ourselves. That's Batman, as opposed to Superman. I don't mean to jump in.
Enter Stan Lee and the Marvel Universe.
Okay.
This is a digression that I promise will take us somewhere that we actually need to go. So, a year ago I started this daily Daf Yomi podcast called Take One, which tries to kind of have brief conversations about the Talmud with people from all walks of life to show the great big relevance of this text. And the one thing that has always moved me so deeply about the Talmud is sort of considering it in context. Here are a bunch of rabbis, and they're sitting around and having these conversations that we sort of gloss over in the Haggadah because we really want to get to the part where we finally eat. But the conversation we're having is actually quite deep. The temple has just been destroyed. Thousands of years or hundreds of years of Jewish tradition, Jewish life as it is lived, is suddenly impossible because this temple-based religion is now found itself with its very heart ripped out. What do you do? And then they have two incredible insights. The first is that you could take something that previously was lived in the real world with a real place, with real sacrifices and real pilgrimages, and put it in a book, which in of itself is a radical idea. But then comes an even more radical idea, because they understand that if the book is just a list of rules, that if the book is just kind of a very strict, straightforward assertion of you should do this or not do that, or even worse, if it's just a bunch of inspiring aphorisms that leave it up to us to interpret them, it will be lost because we will rebel against them, because we will come out and say, I don't know, this is no longer relevant to me, but I don't know why I should do this. Things have changed, circumstances change. I don't have to keep all these rules. And then everything will sort of fizzle away. So instead of giving us rules, they give us arguments. They give us a record of so many conversations about so many topics, inviting us to join in with them and be a part of their thought process so that we too may embody the same thought process and learn how to think as they thought and feel as they felt and keep something alive for generations that is much, much, much more powerful than simply demanding obedience. And this is what Stan Lee did with the Marvel Universe. He gave us a whole host of very Talmudic superheroes that, unlike Batman or Superman, are disasters, are people with so many flaws and so many appetites that who spend half their time bickering with each other, disagreeing with each other, setting each other up for failure, but at the same time, talking with one another, loving one another, embodying a real community, modeling a real sense of Klal Israel together, of real caring and love, especially for people they really couldn't stand. And once that happens, the understanding or that spirit of the Talmud is captured and brought to life. It is, to quote another one of my great teachers, Leonard Cohen, a manual for living with defeat. Right? It is a reminder that even the mightiest among us are totally, totally fallible, that even the most powerful among us are subject to the same human insecurities and failures and fears, and that all of us together have no other way of doing this except for all of us together, which is an insight that the mighty Batman could never quite muster.
Wow. That's incredible. Yeah. What's the name of the book that you wrote that some of this is?
Stan Lee, A Life in Comics.
Okay.
It is an analysis, a very Jewish theological analysis of Marvel Comics' greatest characters.
Okay, guys, you heard it. Stan Lee. Thank you so much for sharing that. That was amazing. I want to just shift because I know we only have a few minutes left. You recent piece in Tablet magazine, you wrote that the Supreme Court emerged as a microcosm. We're shifting gears here, in its decision about religious observance here in New York City in regard to COVID. What did you mean by that?
Well, so that case was passed down to those who don't remember or weren't paying much attention because it literally came on the eve of Thanksgiving. And it basically took to task the state for handing down a deeply irrational set of guidances when it came to what kind of institutions could or could not remain operational during COVID. What the Supreme Court, among other things, said that one, it still remained unclear why, say, a liquor store could do brisk business, but a shul really couldn't. And it remained even more unclear why you would limit attendance at a shul for, say, 10 people. Whereas some buildings are actually physically equipped to handle safely a far, far, far larger um, number of people daily. What this really came down to, and this is sort of the core of my piece, is the tension that we're seeing right now between fundamentalism and common sense, and it is not the side that you would think would embody each one of these arguments that actually ends up embodying them. Because I think what we're seeing right now is that many people who, in other circumstances, define themselves as liberal, progressive, committed and beholden to science and to reason and to straightforward thought, would go ahead and support policies and politicians like, well, you can't be in a synagogue more than 10 people. And even though, again, some shuls out there are built to seat 3,000, and so even 300 could be done very, very safely.
Mhm.
Whereas I think
Where can I jump in? Where do you think so? What do you think motivated that? I mean, I'm happy about the Supreme Court decision. What do you think motivated New York State, or what do you think is motivating individuals who profess this, scientific,
I
rational
find
approach?
I find that that trying to assert other people's motivations is a dangerous game that I dearly don't wish to play. You could
I mean,
choose.
but do you think that they really, amount of people are singing when they pray? Was there anything legitimate I think there was one church that a lot of people got sick. I guess they weren't practicing social distancing, and then they went, threw out the baby with the bathwater. You can't have more than
Honestly,
10 people.
if we're being very candid, and why be anything else, especially among friends, I think a lot of it has to do with a deep sense of alienation from all things having to do with religious life.
Mhm.
This is so outside of the scope of the lived realities of so many people who make decisions that to go ahead and say, oh well, houses of worship could remain closed because they're not essential, right? By which you mean
Right.
to say, well, they're not something that I do, right? It's yet another reminder of how privilege really works, right? Of how some of these regulations that the people making decisions take to be completely objective
Mhm.
really have to do with their own self perceptions and lived experiences and ways that they interact with the world. At the same time, I think a lot of religious communities, while staying and remaining very vigilant about public health things, said, look, life cannot stop for an unlimited period of time. In fact, there is something monstrous about the idea that we ought to cower in fear. We ought to take precautions whenever possible, yes, but our guiding principle must always be, how can we enable more and more and more communal interaction? Because notions like alienation and loneliness and
Yeah.
depression
Yeah.
and families breaking apart, those are public health risks as well. And
A
my
hundred percent.
thoughts
A hundred
community
percent. And
and
I'll
and
tell you something also, just and I don't know how much you're familiar, but we should write about this also, because and a largely unspoken population that is in the which is at risk for exactly what you're sharing is the MJE cohort, 20s and 30s singles. You see, you know, if you're a family and you cocoon yourself with your family, or even if you're an older person, so this older person has got a much, much higher risk. But here you have people that are not as at risk. And if they don't come to MJE, they don't come to shul, they don't, some of them are stuck in their 2x4 apartments in Upper West Side, Upper East Side, Midtown Manhattan. There's nothing. There's no alternative. There are people who come. We have a minyan every Shabbat. We were outside till about 2 months ago, socially distant, and then we moved inside. And this one gentleman came over to me. He says, "You know, this is my only social interaction of the week." And we do our kiddishes on the roof so we can eat outside. And we do the service inside, 6 feet, HEPA filters, cross ventilation, plexiglass. We got the whole kit and caboodle. But I really appreciate what you're saying, because it's um, for the first time in my whole rabbinic career, I kept my phone on Shabbat because I have students who were, I don't want to say suicidal, God forbid, but it was bordering on that.
Right.
But how do you then feel about the other? Oh, I want to say one positive thing about New York State or New York City. We did have a lot of support and help from the NYPD and local people here for high holiday services. I got a lot of space. I had close to 400 people that prayed with us for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur outside, and we literally took over blocks in New York City, which I don't know if that ever happened, where you literally had hundreds of Jews praying on the street. The streets were not blocked off, so you had pedestrians, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, just walking through with their dogs, doing grocery shopping, all the delivery men coming through. And I have to tell you, the sentiment that we got from those passerbyers was nothing other than positive. And, lots of pro Biden all over, because it was during the election, it was, and it was clearly, we're in New York City, but there was a tremendous, I think, support. Like, all the power to you, Rabbi. I can't even tell you how many people we just included in the service as they were walking by. So I wanted to mention that, but how do you feel then about what's happened in the more, I guess, Hasidic parts, ultra orthodox parts of the community? And I'm not generalizing, because I know that many ultra orthodox Jews have been very careful, have taken precautions, wear masks, but we also know that a good segment has not either. So how do you kind of, I don't know, navigate both of those?
Look, I'm an outlier. I will say that when you look at my Haredi brothers and sisters, I find that for the most part, I think the community, which is inherently at greater risk because it is a community where intergenerational families, which is one risk factor, live together in very tight quarters, which is another risk factor, handled things admirably from two different perspectives. First of all, from the perspective of actually taking precautions, because you could, if you wanted to, look at some actual facts and figures. For example, when the city was deciding where to give the vaccine first, the De Blasio administration, which some of our listeners may remember, blamed the Jews first in April. Put out a list of the zip codes that were worst hit by COVID over time. Literally, not a single one among them was a Haredi neighborhood in Brooklyn or elsewhere. So that, first of all, I think teaches us something about this myth that Haredi communities were somehow worse hit. So that, I think, gives us all the indication that we need, that precautions were taken. But I think the Haredi community did something else that is admirable and something that I personally wish to emulate, and that's that.
But how
When
do you, but just even before you say the second point, and I want to hear the second point, but what about those pictures of, the weddings and the large gatherings? I myself was in Muncie
Right,
for a couple
no,
of months. I went into some shuls to daven, to pray, and I couldn't go inside. Nobody was wearing any mask, and they were on top of each other.
Rabbi, there were, and sadly, I know this also from experience, having had friends who were there, and or seen photos snapped on cell phones and or driven by. But there were bars on the Lower East Side, or in Bushwick, or in Greenpoint, where hundreds and hundreds of people were congregating every week for months. They were not reported to us because the people
Right.
in these gatherings, they look like us. They're not the weird ones with the beards and the black hats. They're not the ones we're taught to fear. They're the right kind of Jews, not quote unquote the wrong kind of Jews that we're supposed to feel othered and alienated from. But
Hmm.
I want to turn the whole thing on its head and say that there's a second thing that I think we need to learn from our Haredi brothers and sisters, which is learning to put things in perspective. When this pandemic started, or not so much when it started, let's say in June or July, August, I would hear so many of my friends saying, "Oh, well, I really miss Shul. I can't believe that we won't have Rosh Hashanah services together. Oh, but isn't it great that my favorite Japanese restaurant has outdoor seating, because it was virtually impossible to get a seat at almost any kind of Upper West Side
Hmm.
restaurant
Hmm.
during much of
Hmm.
the pandemic when the seat aside. The fact, and I'm very glad and not at all surprised to hear that MJE kept the torch going and met in person, but many other communities didn't, and many other individuals didn't. And here's why. Because it simply wasn't a priority. Not like restaurants were, not like vacations were, not like a lot of other things that rank much higher on the priority list. I think what the Haredi community has shown us is that what a community could actually do and achieve when it actually works together and when it actually preserves its own values and continues to sanctify, and I don't use this word lightly, what truly matters to it, how it could keep Jewish life vibrant and safe and present, and thriving without succumbing to this initial step of saying like, oh, we will shut down at the first notion of trouble. We would listen to experts even when it becomes very clear that the experts are failing gravely and are causing tens of thousands of deaths, as is now sadly being reported about our great state of New York. um, a community that really, I think, stood firm, that remained healthily skeptical, that remained compliant with what was important and evident, that remained overall healthy, and most importantly, that remained dedicated to the values that had seen it through much greater challenges than this and shall see it through much greater challenges than this. Our tendency in quote unquote secular world to resort and revert back to, again, this kind of atomization, every person for himself or herself, every family for itself, is disastrous. And this is a large part of the reason why we're simply not able to beat it, because we don't have a society anymore. We have just this connection of individuals that expect local government or national government to take care of all the problems. This is not how human beings actually live.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate what you're sharing. First of all, I'm in complete agreement that Jewish life, synagogue life, is essential, and it was really embarrassing that the people we live with in this great city did not see it that way, and let bars and restaurants stay open and not shuls, and that's absolutely wrong. And you have to admire a community, and I love the way you talk about ultra orthodox as our brothers and sisters. Okay, and that's exactly what it is. Nothing less. At the same time, I would take issue. Use two words: safe and healthy. Okay, the only thing I would take issue respectfully is that I just don't think it was always safe, and unfortunately, a lot of people died. And a lot of people now, would some of those people have died anyway? I think you made the point that that community is much more susceptible and vulnerable because you have multi-family units living with each other, as you said. So that's just going to happen. But the question is, I remember last Purim, we're about to hit Purim again. Okay, and we weren't going to close. I wasn't sure what to do. I'd come into contact with someone who tested positive, so I couldn't go. So one of my colleagues was going to run it, Rabbi Ezra, and he said, "Mark, I don't think it's a good idea." And I have to say, it's a year later. I'm happy we didn't. I'm happy we closed, and because people died from Purim, and in the next couple of months, some of those same parts of the community, not all of them, but I know some of them stayed open without masks, and they were not careful, and they were not safe, and as a result, they didn't stay healthy. Um, that's I think that's the reality, not of part of the community. And I also think what you said before is also the reality, which was that New York City was incredibly unfair, discriminatory,
Well,
blamed. I think they're both true, and
I
I
just
think
want to add one more reminder, which I think sadly is a really important reminder, and this one is not about religion as much as it about science. Science is not religion. I say this because I believe it needs to be said. Science is a methodology, and it's a methodology that is predicated on skepticism, on the idea that things change, that available data changes, and with it, recommendations change, which is why it's silly, for example, to say, oh, the experts don't know anything because at first they told us not to put on masks and then they told us to put on masks. Well, that's what happens when more
right,
data becomes
right,
available and different, better ideas come along. However, when you sink, as I would say, the overwhelming majority of at least people I know in my social circles, right, have sunk into this idea of like, we must absolutely never ever question anything that is told us by anyone at any level, and
right,
must never
right,
ever make any decisions for ourselves. I would say, not only is that deeply contrary to the spirit of this here United States of America, or this here Judaism, but also really to the spirit of science, which invites us to observe recorded facts, to act accordingly, to understand the risks as we're taking them, and to do precisely what you just said you did. It's Purim. What do? We know that we don't know enough. We know that the risk is real. We cancel. As far as I'm concerned, difficult decision, exactly the right one to do. What scares me is that when people become religious fundamentalists and say, no, 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 nothing here is open to question. We need
right,
to double down and
right. Yeah,
triple down
that definitely happens.
because it's some kind of a culture war. It's not.
Yeah,
It has nothing to do with any of it. It's strictly science, which is based on what we know when we know it.
yeah. Well, I just, the one thing that I want to make sure that my students know, because we actually had this conversation just last week online, with my fellowship group, and we were talking about COVID restrictions. I'm, you know, 20s and 30s, New York City, incredibly um, careful. And you would think maybe not as careful if they're not living with their parents. Now everybody's different. People are doing different things. And we are doing what we can to stay open, to keep as vibrant as possible, and to keep as safe as possible. And you have to find that right balance. That's what every community is struggling to do. And now that we have a vaccine, and little by little, we're going to be able to, get out of this. We need to get out of this. And I'm afraid, I know, the famous movie Shawshank Redemption, that we become institutionalized, that we get so used to cowering and so used to staying inside that we're never going to come out. And I'm having this conversation with students of mine who are singles who want to come out, but are just so used to being inside that they actually need a little, come on. It's like after Noach waited, mipnei mehamabul, he waited for the water to subside, and he waited, and God was like, what are you waiting for? It's time. The flood is over. It's time to re-enter, society. And this is the time we're in now, where we're starting to come back out.
See, I love that analogy. I take a slightly grimmer view of it because to me it's not just about coming out; it's what you're coming out to. There's a brilliant book published recently by Moshe Koppel called Judaism Straight Up, in which he makes the very good observation that one thing that makes halacha, genius, is that it is neither top down nor bottom up. It is a system of rules, observations, and decision making that is predicated on authority and experts. Those are the rabbis. It is predicated on what people in the community can and will and can't and won't do, and predicated on the back and forth between all those things to make sure that every changing condition is met in a smart, thoughtful, emotionally intelligent way. Um, I think that one of the things that we're seeing with COVID, and one reason why so many countries across the world are failing so spectacularly at meeting something that you would think for modern industrialized wealthy nations wouldn't be or shouldn't be so hard. It's precisely because we've lost the ability to live halachically. It's precisely because we are now a collection of individuals who depend on a state or a city or a republic to go out and care for all the needs that we have that need meeting. It's precisely because we've lost the ability to live communally that we're having such trouble. And when we get out of it, even if life is declared right now to be perfectly safe and there could be baseball games and restaurants and concerts and everything is okay, I think many of us, I hope many of us, and this will be on an info on a hopeful note, have seen that the real danger to our continuation as a species isn't necessarily this virus or that, deadly as it may be, but it's an inability to truly live together, to truly care for each other, to truly embody this wonderful phrase, Kol Yisrael aravim ze leze. All of Israel are beholden to one another, and I think it applies in certain terms also to all of humankind. If we don't know how to do that, if we just are some people expecting government to take care of us while we quibble on who gets a vaccine when and whether or not vitamin D has anything to do with getting COVID, etc., we're completely doomed because there will be another virus and another and another. And we just have seen how vulnerable we are and how desperately we need each other.
Well, I appreciate how significant you take community, not just for Jews, but for the world over. It's a great way to bring this to a close because I have to tell you, Liel, I love the we embrace that you have when you talk. You share what you believe, but you're saying it in a way that's inclusive, and you're concluding now with a call for community, which is really I so much agree how important that is, and how helpful that would be to deal with any future situation that we're desperate for it. We need it, and I thank you so much for giving us your time and your wisdom. You have such great insights. Please, everyone listening to this, get any of Liel's incredible writings, books. Check out Tablet, and check out his. We didn't even mention about Unorthodox, about the podcast that's connected with Tablet. That's
Very much so.
That's Tablet's podcast called Unorthodox, which is, I think, considered like if not the most successful, most widely listened to podcast. And you can hear a little
According
why.
to Rabbi iTunes, that's true.
I want to thank you for joining us and for giving us your insights. And Hashem should continue to bless you and your family, and continue to inspire people and educate people, and enable people to see the beauty of being in the flow. The video game conversation we had was just incredible. Thank you so much for your time. Liel Leibovitz, get his stuff, podcast, books, articles, and we hope to stay in touch. And I'm looking forward for my son to be able to take a full semester with you.
Rabbi, thank you so much for everything you do, and it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Liel. This is awesome.